While the West meticulously debates aid packages, often laden with strings and conditions, China has quietly signed Africa a blank check, a commitment of resources and opportunity, seemingly without the usual constraints. Zero tariffs on a vast range of goods, zero taxes on key exports, one new gateway to power, influence, and economic transformation. This single policy decision, quietly announced amidst the grand pronouncements, has sent shockwaves through global trade.
China says it will provide zero-tariff treatment for 6 least developed countries in Africa. Starting from Monday, 98% of taxable products from Angola, the Gambia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, Mali and Mauritania will be exempt from tariffs when entering China. This will increase the number of African countries receiving such treatment to 27 by the end of this year. China also plans to expand its zero-tariff.
You've always said that China has done more for Africa than any other country.
I mean, it's true. That's not something anybody can argue with.
Yeah.
I mean, they came, they laid down infrastructure. They actually did something that the European countries been around for 400 years and did nothing. That's why if you see Africa now hasn't been developed. This was the responsibility of France, Great Britain, Italy, Germany. These guys have been in Africa forever.
The shift did not announce itself with a single treaty or a dramatic speech. It arrived quietly, disguised as statistics buried in trade reports, new shipping routes plotted on obscure maps, and contracts signed far from European capitals. At first, Europe dismissed it as noise, temporary fluctuations driven by pandemic recovery, currency swings, or political cycles. But as the numbers accumulated and the patterns hardened, denial gave way to unease. Something fundamental was changing in global trade, and Europe was no longer at the center of it. For decades, Europe had shaped the rules of international commerce. Standards, certifications, financing mechanisms, and market access were designed in boardrooms and institutions that assumed European centrality. Africa, long treated as a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of finished goods, occupied the margins. China, once viewed as a manufacturing hub dependent on Western markets, was expected to follow rules set elsewhere. That world was dissolving. The first signs appeared in ports. African harbors that once struggled with congestion and outdated infrastructure began expanding at a pace that startled observers. New terminals rose where colonial-era docks once stood. Rail lines pushed inland, linking mines, farms, and industrial zones directly to the sea. Financing came quickly. And without the prolonged negotiations Europe was accustomed to, projects moved from planning to execution in months, not years. China's role was impossible to ignore. It did not present itself as a savior or a teacher, but as a partner with a clear agenda. It wanted resources, markets, and influence, and it was willing to build the pathways to secure them. African governments, long frustrated by conditionalities and slow-moving European processes, found the clarity appealing. Deals were pragmatic: infrastructure in exchange for access, manufacturing zones in exchange for long-term supply. Contracts. The terms were debated, sometimes contested, but they were negotiated directly. Europe watched as African trade patterns began to shift eastward. Exports that once flowed primarily to European buyers were increasingly redirected. Minerals critical for batteries, electronics, and renewable energy were locked into long-term agreements that favored Asian markets. Agricultural products bypassed European middlemen, shipped directly to destinations where demand was growing fastest. Even cultural goods, music, film, fashion found new audiences through digital platforms, dominated by non-European players. At first, European policymakers responded with familiar tools. They emphasized values, sustainability standards, and historical ties. They warned African partners about debt risks and environmental concerns. These arguments had once carried weight. Now they sounded distant, even patronizing. Two leaders focused on industrialization and growth. Africa was no longer asking for permission. It was negotiating terms. The economic consequences for Europe unfolded unevenly. Some sectors felt the impact immediately. Manufacturers dependent on steady supplies of African raw materials faced price volatility and shortages. Agricultural exporters discovered that African markets they once dominated were now sourcing elsewhere or producing locally. Logistics companies saw volumes decline on routes that had been reliable for generations. In industrial regions, factories slowed. Orders were delayed as inputs became more expensive or harder to secure. Workers noticed overtime disappearing, then shifts. Governments responded with subsidies and emergency measures, but these treated symptoms, not causes. The deeper issue was structural. Europe's role in global trade was shrinking as new networks formed without it. Africa's transformation was not accidental. Years of policy coordination began to bear fruit. Regional trade agreements reduced internal barriers, allowing African producers to scale. Digital payment systems simplified cross-border transactions. Investments in energy expanded manufacturing capacity. The continent's youthful population, once framed as a challenge, became an asset as skills training aligned with industrial needs. China adapted its strategy alongside this evolution. Rather than simply exporting finished goods, it increasingly localized production. Factories moved closer to raw material sources. Joint ventures trained local workers and managers. Supply chains shortened, reducing costs and vulnerability. The result was a trade ecosystem that linked African production directly to Asian consumption, with Europe increasingly sidelined. European businesses attempted to adapt. Some sought partnerships in Africa, only to find that competition had intensified. Chinese firms, backed by state financing and long-term strategies, could offer terms European companies struggled to match. Others relocated production, but regulatory complexity and political hesitation slowed progress. Europe's strengths, high standards, strong labor protections, environmental safeguards became constraints in a faster, more competitive environment. Public debate within Europe grew sharper. Critics accused policymakers of complacency, arguing that reliance on historical advantage had bred inertia. Supporters defended existing models, warning that abandoning values for competitiveness would erode social cohesion. Meanwhile, voters felt the impact in rising prices and uncertain employment, fueling political fragmentation. Africa's leaders navigated their own challenges. Dependence on any single partner carried risks, and debates about sovereignty, debt, and environmental impact intensified. Civil society groups scrutinized agreements, demanding transparency and fair distribution of benefits. The relationship with China was not frictionless, but it was dynamic, constantly renegotiated as circumstances changed. What distinguished this moment from earlier shifts was agency. Africa was not simply reacting to external pressures. It was shaping outcomes. By diversifying partners and insisting on value addition, it moved up the trade hierarchy. Raw materials increasingly left the continent processed, capturing more revenue and jobs locally. Europe, accustomed to buying inputs cheaply and selling finished goods back, found this model disrupted. Global institutions struggled to keep pace. Trade rules designed for a different era failed to address new realities. Dispute mechanisms lagged behind rapidly evolving agreements. Europe advocated reform, but its influence within these institutions had diminished as emerging economies coordinated their positions. Culturally, the shift was profound. Narratives of dependency gave way to stories of negotiation and ambition. African entrepreneurs spoke openly about global strategy, not aid. Universities expanded programs focused on industrial policy and international trade. Young professionals saw futures connected to Asia as much as to Europe. Europe's loss was not absolute but relative. It remained wealthy, technologically advanced, and influential. Yet influence was now shared, contested, and conditional. The assumption that Europe would always be the preferred partner no longer held. Trade followed. Growth was accelerating elsewhere. As supply chains reoriented, environmental implications surfaced. Shorter routes reduced emissions in some cases, while rapid industrialization raised concerns in others. Europe attempted to reassert leadership through green standards and carbon mechanisms, but these were often perceived as barriers rather than incentives. African and Asian partners sought solutions that balanced sustainability with development, resisting frameworks imposed from outside. Years into the transition, the contours of a new trade map became clear. Africa and China formed a dense web of exchange, investment, and shared interest. Europe occupied a position on the periphery of this network, still connected but no longer central. Adjusting to this reality required more than policy tweaks. It demanded a rethinking of identity and strategy. Some European states began to respond creatively. They invested in niche technologies, specialized manufacturing, and collaborative research. They pursued genuine partnerships rather than prescriptive relationships. Where humility replaced assumption, doors reopened, but progress was uneven, hindered by internal divisions and slow consensus building. The world had not turned against Europe. It had simply moved on. Trade had become multipolar, shaped by those willing to build infrastructure, take risks, and align interests. Africa and China had done so with clarity and speed. Europe, bound by legacy systems and internal debates, struggled to match the pace. In the end, Europe's losses revealed a broader truth about power in the modern world. Influence is not preserved by history alone. It must be renewed through relevance. Africa and China rewrote global trade not by breaking rules, but by creating alternatives that better served their goals. Europe now faced a choice. It could cling to past dominance, lamenting a world that no longer existed, or it could adapt, engaging as one partner among many in a system defined by negotiation rather than hierarchy. The outcome would determine not just Europe's place in global trade, but its role in a future where power is shared, contested, and constantly redefined. The momentum did not slow after Europe recognized what was happening. In many ways, that realization came too late. By the time policymakers began speaking openly about strategic autonomy and re-engagement, the architecture of global trade had already shifted. Contracts had been signed for decades, infrastructure was locked in, and supply chains were reoriented around new centers of gravity. Europe was no longer negotiating from a position of quiet authority, but from one of visible urgency. Inside European institutions, task forces multiplied. Reports circulated warning that reliance on external suppliers for critical minerals, agricultural inputs, and industrial components had reached dangerous levels. Yet when officials attempted to renegotiate terms, they found counterparts less accommodating than before. African negotiators arrived prepared, data in hand, united by regional blocs and backed by alternative buyers. The familiar leverage of access to European markets no longer carried the same weight when demand elsewhere was stronger and growing faster. Africa's rise in global trade was no accident of geography or chance. It was the result of deliberate policy choices made over years. Governments invested heavily in logistics corridors that connected landlocked regions to ports. Power generation expanded, reducing one of the biggest historical constraints on manufacturing. Education systems, while still uneven, began prioritizing technical skills aligned with industrial goals. These efforts did not eliminate challenges, but they changed the trajectory. China's engagement evolved alongside these developments. Early criticisms that it sought only extraction lost force as processing facilities appeared. On African soil, smelters, refineries, and assembly plants altered the trade equation. Instead of exporting raw and importing finished goods, African countries increasingly exported intermediate and finished products. This shift captured more value locally and reduced dependence on European industrial chains. European companies felt the pressure acutely. Firms that once dominated African markets found themselves competing on unfamiliar terms. Price alone was no longer decisive. Speed, financing, and willingness to localize mattered more. Some companies adapted, forming joint ventures and transferring technology. Others withdrew, unwilling or unable to operate without the advantages they once took for granted. Political consequences followed economic ones. Regions in Europe heavily dependent on export-oriented manufacturing experienced rising unemployment. Farmers struggled as African producers, now more efficient and better connected, competed directly in global markets. Public frustration grew, feeding narratives of decline and loss. Political movements emerged promising protection, revival, or withdrawal from global commitments. None offered easy solutions. Meanwhile, African public discourse shifted noticeably. Trade was no longer discussed solely in terms of foreign exchange earnings, but as a tool for national development. Debates focused on industrial policy, labor standards, and environmental impact. Civil society groups scrutinized deals with China as closely as those with Europe, demanding transparency and local benefit. This internal contestation signaled maturity rather than instability. The Global South more broadly took note. Latin American and Asian nations observed Africa's strategy and drew lessons. Diversification of partners, insistence on infrastructure, and leverage through regional unity became common themes. The world economy grew less hierarchical and more networked, with multiple hubs replacing a single center. Europe attempted to respond through regulation. Carbon border adjustments, stricter sustainability standards, and traceability requirements were introduced, framed as necessary for climate action. While well-intentioned, these measures were often perceived abroad as defensive barriers. African and Asian partners questioned why standards tightened only after Europe's dominance waned. Trust eroded further. In trade negotiations, Europe increasingly found itself isolated. Proposals stalled as blocs coordinated positions without European leadership. Voting patterns in international institutions reflected this shift. Influence that once flowed naturally now required coalition building, compromise, and sometimes concession. Culturally, Europe grappled with the loss of narrative control. For generations, it had told the story of globalization as something it designed and managed. Now stories emerged elsewhere, emphasizing self-determination and alternative paths to development. African media outlets covered trade deals with confidence, analyzing global trends without reference to European approval. The psychological impact within Europe was profound. Decline is not just economic. It is emotional. Societies accustomed to setting the pace struggled with adjustment. Universities, think tanks, and policy circles debated whether Europe's model slow, consensus-driven, values-heavy could survive in a faster, more transactional world. Some argued that adaptation was possible without abandonment. Others feared irrelevance. Africa's trajectory was not without setbacks. Infrastructure projects faced delays. Debt levels rose, sparking internal debates about sustainability. Environmental concerns intensified as industrial activity expanded. Yet unlike earlier eras, these debates took place within African political systems rather than being dictated from outside. Choices were contested locally, reflecting ownership of outcomes. China, too, adjusted. As African partners grew more assertive, negotiations became tougher. Labor practices, local content requirements, and profit-sharing arrangements were revisited. The relationship matured, moving from asymmetry toward pragmatism. Mutual dependence replaced simple dominance. Years into this transformation, global trade looked fundamentally different. Supply chains were shorter, more regionalized, and less centered on Europe. Africa-China corridors rivaled traditional transatlantic routes. Investment flows followed growth, and growth was increasingly concentrated outside Europe. Some European states found paths forward. They focused on specialized technologies, high-end manufacturing, and research-intensive sectors. Partnerships with Africa were rebuilt on more equal terms, emphasizing co-development rather than extraction. These successes, however, were exceptions rather than the norm, constrained by internal divisions and slow decision-making. The broader lesson was clear. Global trade rewards adaptability, not memory. Africa and China succeeded because they aligned strategy with ambition, infrastructure with policy, and negotiation with leverage. Europe faltered not because it lacked resources, but because it underestimated how quickly others could learn, organize, and compete. In the conclusion of this long transition, Europe's loss did not mean collapse, it meant recalibration. Power had shifted from concentration to distribution. Influence now flowed through networks rather than hierarchies. Africa's partnership with China was one manifestation of this reality, not its sole driver. The future remained open. Europe could still play a meaningful role, but only by abandoning assumptions of entitlement and embracing genuine partnership. Africa's rise demonstrated that global trade is not a fixed structure, but a living system shaped by those willing to invest, coordinate, and assert their interests. In that sense, Europe's challenge was also an opportunity. The end of automatic dominance forced clarity. The world no longer revolved around a single axis. It moved through many centers, each negotiating space and value. Africa and China rewrote global trade by acting decisively within this new reality. Europe now faced the task of deciding whether it would adapt to the rewritten map or continue searching for a world that no longer existed.